Hello guys, welcome to this second session from Walworth Garden Apiary on beekeeping. This session is going to be a focus on beekeeping in an urban setting like London, and we'll talk about the number of bees in London and so on. So off we go. So beekeeping started really as honey hunting. People didn't know how to keep bees, but they knew they could encourage bees to go into places, and then they knew the bees would make honey, so they would harvest the honey. And in doing so, that would kill off the hive, of course. You can see them. So in Egyptian times, beekeeping is mentioned, in biblical times, and they got the bees to nest in jars or hollow logs or so on. And by medieval times, in Europe at least, bees were being kept in straw skeps. And this is a skep in this picture here. Is kind of a basket that's upside down, and the bees would make their comb in there. But when they, as I said, when they came to harvest the honey, it would kill off the colony, and that was obviously not very good. But in 1851, everything changed when the Reverend Langstroth invented the modern box with the movable frames, which it looked pretty similar to what we've got today, actually. Things have refined a little bit, but in essence, what we had then is what we've got now. And that enabled the queen to be in the brood box, a queen excluder, supers for the honey, so the honey didn't have brood in it. The honey could be harvested without disrupting the colony. That was a revolution in beekeeping. And it's been so successful that now more bees are kept in boxes managed by humans than live in wild colonies, and that has some implications for evolutionary development of further bees, because we've now intervened into that selection process and are starting to control what the bees do. This is just an example from Nepal, because I happen to have my sister living in Nepal near Kathmandu. She's been there for 28 years now, married to a Nepalese and with children there. So in Nepal, the honey hunters are quite famous. In the Annapurna foothills, they harvest the honeycombs, and this is in 2007. And it's a different species, Apis cerana, which is a bigger bee than ours. And you can see the guy is down there on a rope ladder. He's got very limited safety equipment. The comb is here, and you can see the bees on the comb. He's got two long poles with knives at the end, tied onto the end, just ordinary knives tied onto the end of these bamboo poles. And this is a basket being lowered from the top of the cliff. He's probably 100 feet up here, certainly fatal if he fell. No safety harness or anything. And he's cutting the hive so it will fall into the basket and then be harvested. And this is a rare source of sugar and protein. They eat the whole comb and larvae and all. But fascinating to see. Just a bit of an aside. Now a bit of fun. This is about sting pain. I'm not quite sure why someone did this research, or even probably how they did it. But you've got along the bottom here, you've got different parts of the body, and you've got the severity of sting painfulness is on the vertical axis, and you can see the average, or the control level is set at the forearm there at a factor of 5, and you can see some parts are less painful and some parts are more painful. So where you don't want to get stung is on the nostril or upper lip. But quite why someone would test out penis or scrotum or armpit or nipple or anything, I don't know, but it does depend on where you get stung. But an important point here amongst the slight humor is that when a bee stings, the venom sac comes out of the worker bee's body, and that will continue to pump venom into the wound. So it's important to get that venom sac out quickly when you get stung. And the way to do it is with a credit card, edge of a key, a fingernail or whatever, and push it backwards out, so that you stop the pumping of venom into your sting, and that will make it much less serious than it would otherwise be. What you don't want to do is to squeeze the venom sac and squeeze more venom into your wound. The other thing which happens when you get stung is that the bee emits a pheromone, an alarm signal, and other bees are alarmed by that, and they're alerted, and they will come along and tend to sting as well. So that can have a feedback effect and can end up with a runaway feedback loop if you're not careful. And that's when people get stung very badly, and that can and has proved fatal in odd occasions, though very rarely. So what do we need to keep bees? A suitable container. The slides I inherited said preferably wood. You can now get polystyrene type containers, high density polystyrene containers, which have some advantages. You obviously can't scorch those, but they're cleaned with solvents and cleaning materials instead. You want the beehive to be a suitable height, easy to handle. The honeycomb is on frames, and the frames are suspended in boxes with bee space. And bee space is the space between the frames. You notice when we open up the hives that the frames have lugs on them, the spacers to keep them apart. And the space is just enough for two bees to be back to back on the gap between the two frames. And that means that that's exactly a bee space. If the space is bigger than bee space, then they'll build comb in it. If it's smaller than bee space, then they'll tend to propolize it and seal it up. So the bee space is an ideal distance. It's about 3/8 of an inch if you work in imperial UK measures, or about 8 or 9 millimeters in the metric system. And the general trend which we've been doing in Walworth Garden is to work with the bees rather than to work against them, and understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and to fit in with that and to facilitate it rather than to work across. I think you're all familiar with these hive components. This is a national, what's called a English national hive, which is the most common one used in England. Different hives are used in different countries, and they look slightly different to this. Some have a sloping roof, for example. But my philosophy has always been, whichever country you're in, you use the hive that's most commonly used in that country, because components will be cheaper, more readily available if you want to borrow or steal them from someone else. And this is a perfectly serviceable hive for what we want to do. So there's a floor at the bottom. This has got normally an open mesh floor for ventilation purposes. The brood box, which is larger, and 11 frames in the brood box. A cleaning excluder above the brood box. The super for the honey, so the honey the queen can't get into the super and lay eggs, so there's no brood in the super. The crown board above the super defines the limit of the colony, and then there's a roof on top for weatherproofing. Very basic, but that seems to work pretty well. That's exactly what we've got at Walworth Garden. So for novices, this is an idea of giving them an idea of how the hive develops, how the colony develops within the hive. And just as a reminder, you have to think of the colony as the organism, not the individual bee. So the first picture on the view on the left is looking side on, and that's a photo from one of the frames from Walworth Garden below. But normally what you've got is brood towards the bottom area in the middle, and then pollen above that, because they're feeding the pollen to the young larvae, and then nectar around. So it's a classic frame would look like that. And then if you look from the top, here are your frames down there. Normally the brood would be in the middle of the hive, and the stores would be at either end. So these frames at either end would have nectar or more pollen on them, and this would be where the queen's doing most of the laying. So when you put these two views together, you can see that the brood nest in the middle of the hive, of the middle of the brood box, is kind of a rugby ball shape, oval shape, and that will be classic. And that's probably what I've got in the hives at present in Walworth Garden. This is a very important slide, reminding us of the 5 reasons you might have to inspect a colony of bees, and it's always worth reminding ourselves, why are we looking at the bees today? What's the purpose of this inspection? And at different times of the year, it will be different reasons. So at this time of year, well, mostly through the year, is the queen present and is she laying? So normally when we do a full inspection of the hive, we try and locate the queen. That's why we mark the queen, so she's more visible. But she's also detectable because she's bigger, as we saw last time, and she scurries around in a slightly different behavior than the other bees. If you can't see the queen, haven't seen the queen, then you look for eggs, because then you know that the queen has laid those eggs within 3 days, because they hatch on day 3. And eggs, as a reminder, look like this here on the right-hand side, about 2/3 of the way up, third cell down. That's an egg laid singly at the bottom of the cell. And after 3 days, it becomes a very small larva like that, and eventually builds up into bigger larvae like these. So the first reason is the queen present, and is she laying? So it's the colony queen right. That's what beekeepers say. The second reason for inspecting is, has the colony got enough room? And that means enough room until you're going to inspect it next time. So if you're going to inspect it the next day, then that's one thing. If you're going to inspect it in a week's time, that's another thing. So room means room for the queen to lay. And in thinking about that, you need to think, is there a lot of unhatched brood? And that means there are going to be a lot more bees in the hive. That will create a lot more crowding. Is there room to store more incoming nectar and pollen? And if there's not enough room, then the normal thing to do is to add another super to increase the space. If the bees feel that they are overcrowded, there's not enough room for them, then they will tend to swarm. So that's normally a trigger for swarming. So is there enough room is the second reason. The third reason is whether there are any play cups or queens. That's normally in the springtime when the swarming tendency is highest. So look for play cups. We'll have a look in a minute at some of those. And are they present and are they charged? And if they are, then you need to try to prevent swarming, because if there's queen cells present, then the colony will swarm. And if you want to prevent swarming, you can do things like an artificial swarm or a shook swarm, which can help to dissuade the bees from swarming. The fourth thing to look for is other signs of disease. So normally in the spring, early summer, you'll be looking for signs of disease in the brood box. And the most important thing, certainly when we're starting out as beekeepers, is to know what healthy brood looks like, and then to look for deviations from healthy brood. And if you see a deviation, then you can take pictures, track it down, ask people, look in books, on the internet, whatever, and find out what problems you've got. But the 3 things you need to look for are the larvae pearly white, like this one here, nice pearly white? Are they C-shaped, bent round? And are they segmented? And you can see the segments. That's perfectly where it should be. And especially if they're evenly laid, you've got things going really well. And so just look for deviations from that initially. And the fifth thing is, are there enough stores, again, until the next inspection? That's what we're doing in the winter and in the spring. At this time of year, we're in February, and unusually the queen is laying and the colony is building up very quickly. So there's not a huge amount of nectar out there for the bees to eat. So they need stores in the hive. The question is, have they got enough honey? And normally over winter, we'd leave them with 25 kilos of full super or super and a half of honey. And if they haven't got enough, then we feed them with sugar syrup in the autumn or fondant in the spring. So those are the 5 reasons to inspect a colony of bees. And it's always worth to think, why we're going to do. By inspecting means go into the brood box, not just open the top. Then there are 4 really important techniques we need to master. The picture is not so relevant to these 4 because that's a wax moth, which is a pest of beehives. So the first thing is to be able to know how to recognize diseases and how to treat them. So as I said just a minute ago, Start with knowing what healthy brood looks like, and then if you can recognize healthy brood, then you can get on and understand what to do and recognize, treat diseases. The second thing you have to figure out is what's your plan for Varroa control. You need a plan for the year, typically 3 interventions: late summer, midwinter, and in the spring. The third thing you need to manage is swarm prevention and associated swarm control. That's difficult to do. You can try and manage swarm tendencies, but you can't control it fully. So you need to be prepared. That means having enough equipment available so you can do the necessary interventions. You need to be able to recognize the signs of swarm tendencies. I need to be available to take prompt action when you see those signs, because you can't wait. And then the fourth thing to master is feeding. Why you feed, when you feed, and how you feed, and when not to feed. And feeding is much more, seems to be more complicated than people think. But we haven't got time to go into all the details of that today. So Varroa, you all, I think, know about Varroa. These are the mites which came across to Britain, I think, in the early 90s. Apis mellifera, honeybees in Britain, didn't co-evolve with the Varroa mites, so they don't have any natural protection built in. And so the Varroa mites tended to cause a lot of havoc in honeybee colonies in the last 20, 25 years. And you can see how relatively big they are on an adult honeybee here. There's 2 on this adult honeybee. They only breed in the closed cells, capped cells. They don't breed on the honeybees. The honeybees carry them around, and they tend to eat they will bite in and eat some of the hemolymph from the honeybees, but they don't breed outside the cells. And you need to know, so understanding the life cycle of the Varroa mite is important if we're going to know how to treat them. So you can see here the queen is laying an egg in the cell, and that's hatching as a larva, and the honeybee is feeding it. The honeybee has got a Varroa mite on it. That Varroa mite enters the cell, attaches itself to the larva, gets capped, and then this is when the mite breeds in the capped cell. And so you start off with 1, end up with 2, and then that emerges after day 21, sorry. And then you've got more mites than you started with. The mites seem to favor drone brood, and if you recall, drone brood stays as a capped pupa for longer than worker brood, and that means that the mite can undergo 2 stages of reproduction, and so instead of go from 1 to 2, you can go 1 to 2 to 4, and that's why you're going to have an exploding number of Varroa mites in your colony. So you have to treat. Although there are signs now that some colonies in Britain and South Africa and the Caribbean, I think, are developing an ability to cope with Varroa. And for some reason, the bees know when there's a Varroa mite inside the cell, like here. Whether that's by scent or other mechanisms, I don't know. I don't think anybody does right now. But when they detect the Varroa mite in the cell, then they open it up. The mite dies. The larva will also die, but the mite will die, and then they will they can deal with that. And the honeybee colonies which are managing Varroa in that way don't seem to need any interventions by beekeepers. This is a complicated slide. I'm not going to go into the detail of, but it will be in the slide pack, which you'll get. But it's worth reading through because it talks about the Varroa, what the Varroa do, how they breed, the stages the Varroa mites go through, and how they then infect honeybees. But it's too complicated for today. This is a slide which I've been developing to try and demonstrate how beekeeping is seasonal, and just focus on the top part of the table part of the slide. First of all, you've got the months across the top, and then the bees and the brood and the 2 rows. So the bees go from very few, minimum number in January, a few in February, start to build up more and more quickly in May, get to near maximum in June or July, and about 50,000 maybe, and then start to decline to only about maybe 5 or 10,000 in December. And that's driven, of course, by the numbers of brood present in the hive. None in the winter, and then the queen starts laying, and you get some rapidly increase, get to maximum and then decline. And although we have a year from January to December, the beekeeping year is quite often taken from September onwards, rather than starting in January. What I've done below that is to list some of the things which you need to do during the year, and how often you would inspect. So we'll just walk through that relatively quickly. So in the winter months, you're inspecting every 2 weeks, but in the summer months, you need to be inspecting every week because of remember, that's because of the queen cell development. And if you leave it for more than a week, you can get queen cells developing to a fully fledged queen. And then you have the swarming. As soon as the outside temperature gets to about 18 degrees, then you can start a brood inspection. So the time of that could be as soon as the next couple of weeks, early March. And then you're starting to inspect for the brood for health and for queen cells, and that can go on during the summer. And I've indicated the swarm season. We had swarms last year in February, but mostly they're appearing a bit later in the year. So this is when you need to be really vigilant for swarms. The sort of honey, the main nectar flows is coming in April, May, and then again in July. And you need to add supers and extracting honey maybe early in the summer and then late in the summer again. Your varroa treatments will be maybe a shook swarm in the spring. If you time that well, you can time that to align with the swarming season, and can be an intervention to prevent swarming as well. And then after the main honey flow, you can do a second treatment. This is a formic acid mites away quick strips treatment, which works even on closed cells. So it will kill mites in a sealed cell. Then an oxalic acid treatment in December when there is no brood, because the oxalic acid doesn't go into closed cells. So you want to make sure you tackle the mites while they're on the bees. Then feeding. We'll be checking in the winter months. Do we need to add fondant? Have they got enough? And then maybe adding syrup in the spring if they haven't got enough. If there's a cold snap, they're not getting enough nectar. And then again in the early late summer, early autumn, you want to make sure that you leave the hives about this period, September, October, with enough food to last them through the winter. So you shouldn't have to feed in the winter, but mostly that's not always possible. You need to manage the kit, the frames and so on. So if you think about the end of the year, you're cleaning and storing the frames. Then sometime in the winter, you want to check all your stocks, do an inventory. Then you want to purchase it when the sales are on, and be making frames, which we'll be doing in a few weeks' time, I guess. Then other things you could be doing. The winter months are good for studying, catching up on talks and books and YouTubes and so on. Finding and marking and clipping the new queens, something that's worth doing. It's a good swarm management process, particularly in London. End of the summer into the autumn, adding a mouse guard and managing for wax moths. So you can see what we're doing month by month is quite variable through the year, and why you need to go through a whole year if you're going to be an experienced beekeeper. That's all I'm going to say about beekeeping itself right now. I'm going to go on to the London bee situation, what at least we in London beekeepers call the London bee situation now. And there's been a big increase in people wanting to keep bees in the city for all sorts of reasons. And the previous mayor before Sadiq Johnson, he encouraged people to keep bees, and even gave bees away freely to people who weren't experienced, which was a rather unwise thing to do, I think. But people enjoy keeping bees in the city. They connect with nature. It's a hobby where you can get away from it all and escape. Collecting honey gives you a sense of achievement, and it brings a good life in the city, and bees can do a good job. But we seem to have gone over the top with bees in London. And the interest in beekeeping now is just increasing. And there are now more than twice as many registered honeybee colonies in London from 2011 to 2019. And you can see it's gone from 2,000 something to 4,000 something, so it's doubled in that period, and the trend line continues along the same way. Added to these registered colonies, there are lots of unregistered ones as well, and lots of feral colonies, wild colonies. So even with the number we've got here, it's around 3 colonies per square kilometre. But there's some hotspots when the colonies are as high as 50 colonies per square kilometre, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. So some of those densities are really, really high and difficult for bees to manage. These are 2 maps which the London beekeepers have collected. The first one on the left is created by GIGL, G-I-G-L, Green Space Information for Greater London. It's the Biological Recording Centre for London, and you can see all the boroughs. You can see Lambeth there and Southwark here. They're always two triangular boroughs. And this is looking at good quality habitat. So what we've got good quality pollinator forage per square kilometre. And if you know your hectares, there are 100 hectares per square kilometre, so 20 is 20%, which would be pretty good in an urban environment to have 20% good quality forage. The data is quite old, but it hasn't changed very much in the intervening 10, 12 years. And you can see that the amount of forage varies hugely across London, and you've got places where you get out towards the outer parts, and there's a lot, and into places like Richmond Park and so on, down the south of Croydon and Bromley. But in the centre, particularly around inner London boroughs, northern Lambeth, northern Southwark, just north of the river, the amount of forage is quite limited. Then you look at the number of registered colonies, and this scale goes from 0 to 30 or more per square kilometre. And you can see that in the sticks, where there are fewer people living, there are fewer beekeepers and fewer colonies. But in the centre, there's lots of people, the population densities are higher, lots of bees. And this is a bee farmer up here in I think it's in Harrow or Brent or somewhere. And he's got 150 colonies on one side, so that's why it skews the data in there. But you see Southwark in particular is quite densely populated with bees. And this is just blown up, taking a snapshot of the central areas of those maps. You can see the sort of not much forage, lots of bees. So in some places there would be too many bees. So where you've got a colony hotspot associated with a forage cold spot, as it were, you have to start asking the question whether the colony density is bad for honeybees themselves. And you can excuse me, estimate that a shortage of forage might lead to weaker colonies, that might lead to robbing. Bees have to fly long distances to forage. Honeybees regularly fly up to three miles, but I think they're flying further from inner London. Stress-related colonies may make them more susceptible to diseases and pathogens. When you've got lots of colonies close together, pest and disease spread more easily. And of course, there are lots of feral colonies, wild colonies, and these are probably reservoirs of furor and disease as well. So high densities are probably bad for honeybees themselves, but it's probably also not good for wild bees, solitary bees and bumblebees and other pollinators. Some evidence that honeybee pathogens affect wild bees and can cross over, and emerging evidence that honeybees compete with other bees. Honeybees are very good at collecting nectar and pollen, and they wake up early in the day. And so as the plants only produce a certain amount of nectar per day, it's possible that other pollinators who maybe whose nests are in cooler places wake up later, and there's less for them to eat. Now, more data is needed on those points, but it's pretty obvious to see that at some point you're going to get to colony densities where there will be a problem. And the question is, what level is that, and where is it relative to the numbers we've got in London? But our view is that we're already getting to unsustainable levels in some places. And of course, if you've got hotspots in terms of numbers of colonies, then the risk of swarming are higher, and that can have difficulties in London. feral colonies could cause a problem, and this can all lead to reputational issues for bees and beekeepers. And we're seeing that trend now, in that quite a few of the local authority managers are not keen on having bees on their premises, particularly if they're good for wildlife. So the conclusion from that is London is not a homogeneous environment when it comes to wildlife. It's very varied. Got some very good areas and some very poor areas for habitat. Similarly, the number of colonies is varied in its distribution, and the numbers are going up. So the concern is there that it could be detrimental to honeybees and possibly wild bees as well. So what do we say in London Beekeepers? And this is also the ethos from Walworth Garden, by the way, which is promote and implement what we call the Bees and Flowers Go Together initiative. Bees and flowers co-evolved over millions of years. So encouraging people to plant forage, pick of the right type. So you've got nectar and pollen plants going from February through to November, right through the year. In all land management, trying to get more biodiversity present, increasing wild areas of gardens, parks, and other open spaces, and all the boroughs have got sustainability plans and biodiversity action plans and so on. And so that trend is going in the right direction. And then more difficult to prevent further habitat loss. So we continue to see building on green space, and particularly brownfield land, which is often very good quality for wildlife. When we get developments, is there enough room for green space in those developments? And that's a challenge, always a challenge, because of the financial drivers to build more. Front gardens paved over, plastic grass, and all the things which take away habitats. So that was what we would say we should do. And the London Beekeepers have got 10 guidelines for responsible urban beekeeping, and that's all available in a downloadable PDF from their website. Most important one is being considerate of the social context in London, other beekeepers and other wildlife. And that's where we recommend people to consider whether it's appropriate to introduce more beehives into a particular area if there are already lots there. The other things I think you'll see are pretty obvious, though. Be trained, because beekeeping is not for novices. Keeping nice bees, different strains of bees have different characteristics. If you get bees which are particularly defensive and like to sting people without much warning, change the queen, bring in a nice strain. Practicing swarm prevention and control probably means clipping the queens in the London context, so the queens can't swarm very far, shook swarming and so on, like I've explained. Managing good bee health, so brood inspections and all the things that go with that. Maintaining an apiary which is well maintained from a hygienic point of view, so not leaving wax lying around, not leaving empty combs lying around, disposing of things properly, etc. Registering your colonies, insuring them, joining a beekeeping association like the London Beekeepers, knowing what you do if things go wrong. So if you have to do things and say the beekeeper is not available for a few weeks because of illness, or you get disease, what would you do? What's your contingency plans? Have you got enough frames available for shook swarms, all that sort of thing? And then making sure you're doing your bit to plant enough flowers so that you can support bees and other pollinators around your area. So then it's kind of two typical, the way when people say, how do I start beekeeping? The first of these routes was the one which people always recommended and most people followed. So you do the beekeeping course, which normally is a 2-day intensive course. You take a year's mentoring. You do the British Beekeeping Association basic qualification called the Bee Basic, like a driving test, if you like. Make sure you've got the right space, you buy the equipment, get a swarm, and you commit to weekly inspections and spend lots of money and time. And so one person then could be keeping 3 or 4 hives at one apiary. Sometimes they have 3 or 4 apiaries. So you end up with one person and a lot of bees. The alternative, which we're increasingly recommending, and is the Walworth Garden approach, have an apiary available which volunteers can join. Joining a beekeeping association as part of that, or if there isn't an apiary readily available, form a bee club of your own. That means just a group of you decide to keep bees collectively. Get some practical beekeeping experience for more than a year and take the basic qualification, which is what I did. And then you can share the cost of equipment, share the commitment, and learn from others, or be mentored or whatever. And then you've got a group of maybe 4, 6, 8, 10 people looking after 3 hives, as we have at Walworth, instead of one person looking after 3, 4, 5 hives. So the balance changes, and it becomes more sustainable in the context of what we've seen in terms of London bees. But you also have to remember that everyone can be a beekeeper, even if you don't keep bees, and just go into the park or the garden, cemeteries, whatever, and just looking at the bees and the wildlife, you're then a beekeeper. So you don't have to have your own hives to be a beekeeper. And that will take us through to lunch in the talk. So I'm going to stop there and end the recording if I can